Tom Cruise believed he could make him grin. Despite the criticism, yet Clint Eastwood quiet, steady, and more acute than before about to explain to him why that picture wasn't innocuous. The studio lights constantly thought it was a bit too bright. Austin was the scene of that evening's. There was a buzz on American Perspectives Live. As usual, the audience is slithering during the warm-up. The walls are resounding with laughter, but the air didn't feel quite right. Something that was taut, such as the previous when a storm erupted. Clint Eastwood was sitting at the panel's far end. The kind of presence that is quiet even now, didn't have to say anything to be heard. Wasn't adjusting his pen or tapping it. Mikey was merely observing while grounded. Tom Cruise sat waiting across from him. He donned a fine suit and was as polished as ever. Had a radiant grin and dancing eyes. With that well-known blend of charm and deflection, he appeared as though he was accustomed to being the focus of attention and getting away with it. Only a few days before, Cruise had been present at the Liberty Forum in Scottsdale, Arizona, a gala prominent assembly of alleged the American conservatives, yet behind the stylish flag-line backdrops and stage lights the something else had emerged from the experience. Opportunity to use dog whistles against immigrants masquerading as speeches and a ravenous audience. Tom didn't support it for division, at least he asserted that he simply stood there. He sipped his drink while grinning and clapping. Thought it was an opportunity to see a different perspective of America, just a field trip. Some referred to him as brave, while others called him Tom returned to his house tonight, blind. Lawn, comfortably seated on a chair, he'd filled numerous times prior to being prepared with practiced charm and cautious deflection, but what caught him off guard was for headlines. Clint wasn't there. He arrived not to quarrel but rather because silence in such situations is a decision. That he wasn't prepared to make. The audience began the show as usual. With a kind laugh, the host presented the Clint panel. Tom leaned back with assurance. Not little movement, but when Clint Eastwood, the room would pause when he opened his mouth. Breathing, the host's forward-leaning voice, mild tone practiced, so he said, tonight, we are discussing this week's major controversy, which seems to be you, Tom. The crowd erupted in laughter. Tom Cruise smiled, not loud, not sure. Calmly, he folded one leg across the other and lifted his mug in a toasting gesture. His shrug said, what can I say? I went to it during supper, I heard a few speeches, and that somehow makes me a public adversary. First, more laughs and gives a few claps. Went on, I didn't support anything, I didn't say anything, I think I just watched. That in order to comprehend America. All of America, then occasionally we must be prepared to follow the stories where they lead. Are uneasy. He took a moment to confirm, letting the line dangle, followed by a relaxed. He turned to Clint and nodded. What do you think? I believe you've been around you, Mr. Eastwood. Am more familiar with the nation than most. Incorrect. Tom did things that way. He didn't. He invited the bear out wrapped after prodding it in velvet as if it were a display element. Clint gazed at Tom without a smile. A man observes a person who has just attempted to give him a corroded firearm and label it. His voice was like polished steel when it came to was fairly substantial, resembling rolled gravel. Clint said, I believe, through the oak. Slowly, it matters where a man travels. The crowd moved. It's not noisy, except the sound of individuals sitting more erect, and Clint didn't blink in their chairs. And when that man is being observed by millions, when his image appears on all screen, and as children get older, they think then, that's how an American looks. Yes, being present where it counts. Tom made an effort to shrug it off, but come on, Clint, we can't all survive. Isn't interacting with others in bubbles? As part of the healing process, Clint cocked his head, was that you? Tom opened his tongue to perform healing, but Clint continued. You were standing in a room. Where wickedness was being applauded you didn't wince, you didn't say anything. Tom grinned and leaned forward, attempting to re-establish authority with all proper deference. Clint slightly lifted one hand, but not to hold but not to speak space. He echoed, you with all due respect. You can't just label anything neutral. Since you failed to yell, and for the first time, Tom Cruise was without a return. There was no sound in the room. Even when Tom spoke, even when Clint spoke, attempted to laugh once more as nobody joined him, and Tom moved in his chair, a hardly perceptible flicker, although it was the confidence he had broken. Leaning forward, trying to be light, all right, so now I'm responsible, he remarked with a sly smile. For what a stranger yells during a gala. Clint didn't even raise an eyebrow. No, he said in a voice, you're accountable for what you call and stand next to innocuous. At that point, the audience leaning in, not too much, but immediately, there was something low in his tone. And even the stage workers were grounded. Going upstairs, Tom tried again. How are you? I'm not defending anything. Any divide should be bridged if we cannot enter rooms with which we disagree. Clint waited for a moment of silence. When the tension subsided like dust, you didn't appear to challenge whatever he said. You arrived grinning. And made them feel good about themselves. Tom, his mouth opened, but Clint wasn't completed. A woman was present in that group. Eyes steady, Clint replied, she's the wife of Rosa, is the name of the man I worked with. 30 years of knowing her. He didn't blink. She informed me that her son didn't soften. Was accompanied home that evening from school. Following that gala, the person who grinned through a pickup truck driver slowed and made 3 leisurely circles around their house. Sufficiently lowered to lower the window and yell, go back to where you came from. Nobody moved, and the grin faded from Clint. Didn't raise his tone in response to Tom's face. She's American, therefore he didn't have to. She's from Laredo, and her husband battled for our nation, but that evening that family didn't think they were. Tom stared down at Clint, who belonged here. Placed his hands on the front table. Of him, have you instructed that man to do? Despite the number, he noticed you standing there. Smiling beneath those flags at those speeches, and you are aware that he most likely, he thought, a beat even Tom Cruise understands that even he believes we're not so horrible. Like a drop of water, the line struck the quiet fire, but Tom leaned back, looking irrevocably stunned but unfazed. He remarked, that's not fair, you can't pin. Clint gave me a slow nod, but I'm going to pin it and call it another pause. There is a distinction. The chamber contained its breath. The host looked anxiously in the direction of the author on the panel, and the camera feed had become silent. Even the chatty the strategist seems unwilling to. Clint went on to explain, when someone similar to you and that platform. Entering a place full with hate, reach and smiles as they leave, making many people believe hate isn't that bad. That perhaps it's simply another viewpoint. His voice remained low, but weight growth, and when you refer to it as a field trip investigation or comprehension and never give what you saw its true name. You're no longer only observing. Tom was unable to reply since the crowd was aware that Clint had recently redrawn the distinction between being present and involvement. Clint remained silent. He let the quiet do the talking for a while. Tom was already leaning his gaze back at work. Changing without being entirely composed or defensive. The air had become heavy, even for the host. Had ceased to look at his notes, and then Clint said, I met a boy too, El Paso months ago, he murmured softly. Gabriel is his name, in Texas. He didn't exaggerate it and didn't try to win people over. Told it that 17 was the smartest person in his class. Like him, he aspires to enlist in the army. His goal is to become an officer, brother. Serve his nation. His father is a fireman. Tom's mother owns a diner. Hesitantly looked up, unsure of its location. Clint didn't blink as he went. Gabriel informed me that he ceased to speak out. He once said in class that he pushed returning to a statement made by an instructor about immigration. Someone departed the following day with a 5-word note in his locker. Clint paused and peered out into the crowd. Back to your nation, nobody left. Stated that he wasn't even shocked, saying, it's been arriving for some time, said Clint. Didn't break, yet it contained something deep and he didn't disclose it or report it. I just stopped talking to them. Ceased attending the debate team. Give up one more rhythm for rock since somewhere along someone with a microphone stage or your smile gave the impression that it was alright to sayings like that gave the impression that Clint leaned while normal Tom glanced aside. His tone was still a little pushy. You call it discomfort, yet it's wrapped in sadness. You refer to it as engagement, but that child it's a warning, a signal, and a message. That nobody will take a stand when it occurs, particularly not those who have cameras on them. There were no viewers. Tom tried to be calm, not tense, just still. Clint said, but that's not on me. Stopped him with a look that was neither furious nor I'm not combative, just steady. Clint remarked, you wrote the note, but the world we enter, I'm saying, whether we intend to or not, leave imprints. Clint looked at Tom, but he swallowed hard. The crowd once more, not for impact, but since he intended for them to hear this passage. Indeed, there is a generation of children attempting to determine whether they are viewed as threats in this nation or as sons, as suspects or neighbors. His voice fell a little, and when someone like though you enter a room filled of malice conceals themselves under charm and departs without pointing out that you're not impartial, Tom simply said, your silence is inappropriate. It wasn't a speech or a punch there. Was simply the truth, so clear and simple that couldn't be challenged. The audience didn't. They were still processing, so no clap yet. The sound of an honest person without carrying out. By now, Tom had given up attempting to smile. The room's energy had changed. It wasn't rage at all. It wasn't an argument, it was something more substantial. Clint adjusted the microphone in recognition. Slowly in front of him, I'm not here to cancel on purpose anyone, he continued in a steady voice, but I am here to discuss the meaning of showing up and the meaning of walking away. Tom regarded him with his arms folded in a man attempting to establish himself safely in a chamber that was no longer his. Clint didn't appear upset, instead, he gazed determined. You mentioned that it was only a visit. Merely a gala, but when those in positions of authority in areas where people are being dehumanized and remain silent about what isn't neutrality. Tom attempted with permission to gently push back. You're presuming that. Clint shook his head, which was the worst of me. Letting you know what your silence said. Everyone otherwise, the panel strategist leaned. The writer had returned to his seat, making notes. The audience was not responding. No longer spoke aloud, they were simply. Clint leaned gently into. Listen to you. Claim that you didn't support anything. It's okay to say you didn't speak, but when a man such as yourself, with your reach and legacy enters that space and doesn't name what's going on, and you become helpful. Whether you intend to or not, to them. Tom Clint, his mouth opened and closed. They didn't need your words, you added. Your face was all they needed. Then arrived. It would land like a calm line. Bomb. You don't need to bring a flashlight to illuminate the way for something unsightly. Sometimes simply strolling next to someone is enough. At that point, the room became motionless. Out of shock, but because they. Tom lowered his eyes in understanding. Clint wasn't completed. This has nothing to do with politics, he added, is about being there. Concerning what we let to reverberate behind us when we depart. He glanced across at the crowd. Not for impact, but rather to entice people to the truth. You'd like to identify oneself as an all-okay watcher, but if you spot a fire and don't say anything, you can't act shocked when someone receives. Tom was still burning, there were no disagreements. Clint turned back to enchant, but there was only stillness. You believe that your silence was indifferent. Although it wasn't in words, it was loud. Consequently, the last sentence of the section people like you don't need to say anything. It's wrong for you to be involved. All you need to do is allow the wrong thing to occur. And pretend that you weren't present at the room. The audience wasn't moving at this point. They were no longer fidgeting. Weren't laughing, they were confined. Because Tom Cruise had altered in some way. Sat up straight, he wasn't relaxing anymore. His eyes were dancing and he was still grinning. Now blinked with polished assurance. The host leaned in, heavier and slower. Trying to make a final turn, Clint, some people would say this, she added kindly, has transcended reasonable criticism, that this has evolved into personal. Clint gave him a look at that moment. It is personal, he remarked, glancing at Tom. Pause. Because when individuals are injured by your personal silence, when a child is silent, or a family feels dangerous at their house due to someone who ought to have realized better, grinned, and stated nothing that isn't hypothetical politics aside, that's someone's life. The strategist's real-time unraveling barely nodded, and the writer held her. Not even the crew was written on the notepad. The cameras behind them had ceased to move. Tom inhaled deeply and said, "So what?" He questioned, "Silence, I'm merely meant to keep to myself and never speak to others." Clint disagreed, and he leaned back a little. Nor arrogant, nor victorious, but serene like a man who's been carrying this burden for a longer time, more than the majority of those present have been alive, he replied. No, you go where you talk to anybody you want, but don't act as though you were blind to what you observed, and don't let anyone know it wasn't that terrible. He hesitated once more, since it was Tom. Didn't reply, not in disobedience of another object, the gradual procedure of taking in a reality that prevents you from leave. Unaltered, Clint turned to face the audience, to level rather than perform what most people won't do with them, comment on programs such as this. He stated, "Some of you guys have become so accustomed to being centered that when someone requests that you look from, it feels like an attack from the periphery." A tremor passed through the space, not indignation rather than praise, only a shared. Tom looked to the side in recognition. Observe himself on the delayed. Clint didn't turn away from the TV. We're asking for pity, he remarked. Sincerity. Next arose the phrase that preserved the moment in memory. Clint, when you decide where to stand, spoken in a steady voice, be truthful about what's behind you, since there's always. It wasn't presented like a microphone drop. It wasn't necessary, it was simply. The strategist blinked at the fact. Slowly, the author put down her pen. Still silent, the audience started to move. Not yet to cheer, but to move forward in their seats, drew nearer to an object that had the feel of a mirror rather than a. When Tom did speak, it was not aloud. "You're brave," he continued, "and I'll let you know that." Clint didn't reply. Didn't have to. The credits for the show had not, however, the tone had already rolled. Something had landed, but it wasn't. One may act as though it hadn't. The lights were dimmed, but not completely sufficient to indicate the end of the show, although something remained heavy in the air. Actually, Tom Cruise didn't leave abruptly. Did not defend himself, instead, he simply sat for a couple more seconds, like a man understanding that the script he supplied wasn't for Clint Eastwood, was designed for what transpired. Nonetheless, did not grin. He did not declare a victory. He simply sat back in his chair and nodded. Chair and allow the quiet to speak for itself. Required to roll the credits, however. The people weren't moving the room as usual, rushing for praise or photos. They were seated with an object they hadn't anticipated to sense a change, and outside the world was already in that studio, responding to a grainy video that someone in YouTube and TikTok were popular with the audience. Prior to the last frame airing, it didn't require backing music or elaborate editing. Clint sat motionless and said, "You need not carry a torch in order to illuminate the path for an unsightly item, sometimes it's all requires is strolling next to it." That line didn't yell, yet it reverberated and turned into news stories in a matter of hours. A teacher in for her senior civics, Ohio performed it. Class and inquired, "When does quiet turn into collusion?" The room remained long period of silence. A retired veteran Colorado shared the video again with the caption, "That is the appearance of integrity, like." It was utilized by a Michigan university to host a town hall regarding politics, impartiality and public leadership. A renowned filmmaker who had collaborated with early in the new millennium, Tom Cruise, tweeted, "A distinction exists between being Clint's curiosity and recklessness." Just that line was drawn in the sand. A little Portland bookshop. The statement was hand-painted in vivid red lettering in the church's front window. It served as the theme for Atlanta's Not Everyone Agreed with the Sunday sermon. Claimed that Tom was just and Clint was overly harsh. In an effort to pay attention, this generation is overly sensitive and hasty to place blame. However, they were unable to overlook the ripple. This was more than simply a TV moment. Something deeper and more gradual of change that permeates without blowing Tom up. Cruise didn't make an announcement. Didn't have to, but in his subsequent interview, a meeting that was meant to the first words about his next movie, he stated, "I got a lot from Clint to consider that. I didn't anticipate that dialogue to proceed as it did, but perhaps he didn't need to walk it. For once, he didn't double down. That was sufficient." Clint didn't post about it without taking pleasure in it. He went returning to the ranch and returning to work to the silence that is unnecessary. The problem is that it needs affirmation to feel real. Concerning times like these, they don't have, they simply need to land in order to trend, and for it was indeed heard by those who heard it. They did more than simply concur. They stopped, glanced around, and they began posing increasingly difficult queries, not only about Tom, but also about themselves, regarding the times when they had kept quiet about what they had stood by, grinned, and left without saying anything, since this was about more than just one man. The narrative we use while deciding to remain silent less expensive than Clint and clarity without speaking, he made sure that the price was ultimately